beneath the heavy, brooding skies of the 14th century, where rusted blades glinted in the dew-heavy grass. War was a brutal performance and a calculated game of power. Picture a field of clashing steel and snapping banners, a place where honor was as fragile as parchment left in a storm. The nobility strutted upon this stage, but it was the fields of the peasants that were set ablaze. Here, rules wrapped in fine velvet protected the powerful, while the weak were left to bleed and die in forgotten corners. Capture a lord, and a river of gold would flow like sacrificial wine. Lose a skirmish, and you could expect no mercy. The loopholes woven into the fabric of righteousness could forgive even the blackest of sins. This was a world where valor and duplicity were partners in a wicked, endless waltz across the face of a merciless medieval Europe. Our tale unfolds in the tumultuous heart of this century, where power flowed not only through sharpened steel, but through the intricate, often hypocritical rules that claimed to govern its use. Contrary to the belief that medieval warfare was pure chaos, it operated under a complex patchwork of guidelines, crafted from a volatile mixture of honor, religion, and raw ambition. Yet, as we peer through the fog of history, it becomes clear these rules were not applied equally. For those safe within grand castle halls, war was a noble pursuit governed by lofty ideals. For everyone else, it was a grim and inescapable destiny. In the romanticized twilight of bygone days, the code of chivalry defined the knight's existence, an unwritten vow of valor and honor, a promise to shield the helpless. This chivalric code sought to steer a knight's conduct in both court and the chaos of battle. However, its legacy is woven through with stark contradictions, for these codes were often more aspirational than enforced. While knights were cloaked in these noble ideals, they rarely hesitated to torch villages or slaughter unarmed foes if it served their purposes. The image of the gallant, romantic knight held an undeniable allure, yet it offered vanishingly little protection to the vulnerable commoners caught in its shadow. The architects of these rules, the kings, popes, and great lords, directed the course of medieval warfare, not in pursuit of justice, but in a relentless hunt for power, all cloaked in the authority of God or feudal right. These rulers dictated the standards of conflict, demanding obedience from knights and entire nations alike. Yet their own rules proved fickle, bending to their own desires, often ignored by anyone who wielded enough power to justify the transgression. For the everyday participants, the foot soldiers and the villagers, these grand pronouncements were just stories. The edicts of rulers provided little comfort, leaving commoners to navigate a chaos crafted and commanded by the very masters. They served the law within medieval warfare was a perfect mirror of the era's rigid social hierarchy. The nobility found themselves swaddled in legal protections utterly denied to the peasantry. The law favored them, offering clemencies like ransom instead of summary execution. Yet this honor was a shield for the privileged alone. On the muddy, blood-soaked fields, soldiers who fought without titles witnessed firsthand how these elegant rules offered them no refuge whatsoever. Noble warriors exchanged high-value captives like players in a gentleman's game, but peasants captured in the same fighting faced a merciless fate. Legal systems that promised to shield non-combatants from indiscriminate slaughter only served to reinforce the brutal class divide. leaving the hard, cruel reality for everyone else. The history of the period is riddled with tales of loopholes that conveniently served those in power. Cunning rulers and savvy knights became experts at manipulating religious and social mandates to their own ends. Outwardly bound by codes of conduct, these strategic minds mastered the art of bending the law to their advantage. Such hypocrisy did not escape the notice of those on the lower rungs of the ladder, who saw the double standards clearly but lacked any means to challenge them. It stands as a testament to a reality where fairness was a garment woven to clothe its creators, while deceiving all who observed it. At the heart of the battlefield's chaos were the peasants, mere pawns in a game they could scarcely comprehend. With no army to defend them and no fortitude offered by a knightly code, their plight was most desperate during sieges and invasions. Their humble homes, symbols of their hard-won survival, became battlegrounds devoid of any safeguarded assurances. Against brutality, non-combatants and vulnerable peasants endured betrayal by the very lords tasked with their care, often reduced to bargaining chips without hope of reprieve. Assurances of protection dissolved amidst the turmoil of the moment, reflecting a set of rules that all too frequently spelled utter ruin for the tenants of the land. The constant tension between divine law and secular oaths stirred profound challenges. In adjudicating conduct, church declarations blended mortal limitations with the concept of divine justice, painting conflict within a sacred frame even as rulers pursued immediate earthly goals. When secular and divine loyalties clashed, difficult questions of allegiance arose, pulling worldly obligations under the umbrella of theological oversight. This blending of spiritual favor and naked political intrigue revealed a medieval life built upon a foundation of both devotion and power, complex web of competing realms vying for supremacy, feudal bonds, the very bedrock of medieval society, added another layer of complexity to war. Lords wielded the oaths of their vassals as both a promise and a bridle. Their ambitions were laced with this mutual obligation, whereby war became a tense exchange between ambition and loyalty. Yet lords, driven by their own aspirations, constantly tested and manipulated these feudal threads, enshrining their power within layered motives and martial presence. The results of these feudal relationships colored the rules of warfare, which were replete with the symbols and practicalities of their orchestrated sovereignties. While empires crumbled and clashed with conflicting ambitions, these rules often proved too flimsy to contain the torrent of human endeavor. In the turmoil of collapsing kingdoms and seething disdain, enforceable boundaries became mere illusions. Here, the remnants of history whisper how even the most rigid structures faltered, dissolving under pressure. These unpredictable forces laid bare the tumor at the heart of medieval life, a relentless cycle of upkeep and ruin. Crafting new narratives amid overwhelming chaos, our exploration reveals a world cast in a mosaic of intentions and stark realities. The rules of war, designed to instill order amidst capricious tempests, often found themselves relegated to secondary importance behind immediate, pragmatic goals. On a battlefield that was more a theater of unpredictability than a structured conflict, these stories unravel the effort to impose order, an effort that often lapsed into crude residing. The tales from these times, woven from expectation and reality, shed light on a medieval life precariously balanced between exertion and order, in the perennial, haunting dance of law and lawlessness that echoes through the ages. In the medieval world, the scales of life weighed unequally. Knights, decked in gleaming armor that was as much a symbol of status as protection, occupied the top of this social hierarchy. Bound by pseudo-sacred traditions, a knight's life was not easily extinguished. The dance of chivalry dictated that knights engage each other with the goal of capture and ransom, treating human life as a currency for social standing. Killing another noble brought not only shame, but suggested a failure in strategy or valor. Yet for the common folk, the farmers, the villagers, the townsfolk, this notion of martial honor was a distant, mocking echo. Their lives, easily snatched away, were seen as mere collateral damage in the bloody churn of warfare, sacrificed to a machine that consumed human resources indiscriminately. For mercenaries and rebels, those without a noble crest, death was an expectation. Outlaws considered dishonorable found no mercy at all. Amid this brutal tapestry, the medieval world revealed a chilling disparity in the value placed on human lives during wartime. The chivalric code, a set of ideals meant to civilize the chaos of war, often unraveled in the brutal reality of combat. Knights, the theoretical paragons of noble battle, frequently found themselves desecrating these high-held creeds. The blood-soaked fields told tales far removed from the romance-laden ideals of chivalry. Acts of bitter rivalry and naked revenge often crossed every boundary of nobility. Skirmishes launched under the cover of darkness, and the grim fate of captured messengers reflected a visceral irony. Cloaked in codes of honor, knights could ruthlessly ravage fields under divine banners, their actions guided as much by personal survival and gain as by any ideology. Among the anarchy of battle, friend and foe could blur, exposing the stark ironies of wars, purportedly did by honor. From this chaos emerged the peculiar, coldly logical business of ransom. A captured knight was worth far more alive than dead, speaking a language of pure wealth and fortune. Capturing a knight wasn't an act of dishonor, but a brilliant, strategic opportunity to amass riches and even forge new alliances. The very calculations of warfare adjusted. It wasn't just steel clanging on steel, but a quest for valuable captives. An ethical pragmatism overlaid battle strategy, turning nobles into living treasures rather than casualties. Thus, a captive knight might enjoy laughter and comfortable lodgings instead of the headsman's axe, all paid for by his anxious kin. This interplay of survival and social currency illustrated a medieval existentialism where chivalry blended seamlessly with stark pragmatism. Mercenaries inhabited a completely different world. These hired swords occupied a liminal space between respectable fighters and utterly expendable assets. Kingdoms whose ambitions far outweighed their population's willingness to fight turned to these soldiers of fortune. They were necessary evils, driven by coin rather than loyalty or honor. Death was a simple career risk. Capturing them afforded no thought of ransom. They were too interchangeable, their deaths unmarked by any chivalric valor. Their end came quietly and without ceremony, a stark reflection of the unwritten codes that divided medieval warfare into sanctioned takers and disposable pawns, a harsh mirror of martial chaos. Then there were the rebels, those who dared to sculpt their destinies outside the ordained paths, and who bore the grim consequences for it. Defying the nobility was viewed as both sacrilege and a direct affront to the God-given social order. Once the banners of rebellion were unfurled, all protections evaporated, instantly replaced with the promise of merciless retribution. Branded as traitors, captured rebels faced torture and brutal execution, their bodies paraded as grim warnings to any who might contemplate dissent. Yet defiance persisted, for oppression often sowed the seeds of its own resistance, creating a relentless cycle of hostility. In the shadow of extinction, these factions embodied a relentless quest against tyranny, a somber reminder of medieval society's utter inability to reconcile authority with rebellion. Violence in medieval times doubled as both a tool of control and a potent message. Public executions were not merely punishments, they were declarations, embedded deeply into the societal fabric. Armies etched historical narratives in the blood of their enemies, reinforcing the supremacy of the state with every swing of the axe. Symbols became warnings as sharpened steel flew across contested skies, embedding a deep and lasting fear in the hearts of the populace. Amidst this mournful dance, the people were largely resigned to their fate, knowing their rulers wielded violence to cultivate obedience and impose a harmonious order from the shadow of chaos. The battlefields themselves were a perfect mirror of the social order and intricate theater where every role was defined by status. Noblemen, resplendent with heraldic symbols, were not just warriors but figureheads, presenting allegiance in supposedly equal, dignified confrontations. Striking down a knight might bring gold, but capturing one brought treaties and wealth to those bold enough to do it. Meanwhile, peasants marched unpaid and coerced into battle, their sacrifices lost in the victorious songs sung later, consumed by ambitions they did not share. Their stories remained untold, silent emblems of lives spent under lurid, violent skies. This tapestry of class warfare defined a reality where knights rode tall and peasants crumpled under the wheels of war machines, locked in a perpetual, unyielding hierarchy. When armies overran villages, chivalric codes offered scant salvation. Victory morphed enemies into resources, their belongings and homes pillaged as rightful rewards. A defenseless village would succumb to eager, plundering hands. Churches were desecrated, fields ravaged, all while warlords reveled. Even knights, the supposed custodians of chivalric ideals, freely indulged in the spoils, their looting cloaked as rightful penance. Soldiers saw beyond their warlords' agendas, content in a system that consistently failed to align the reality of war with the virtues of honor. Pillage became an unwritten, accepted pact between victors and vanquished, defining medieval warfare's skewed morality and revealing a chilling contradiction at its core. The great irony of war lay in the stark contrast between the noble aspirations of knights and the grim realities they created and inhabited. Rich robes governed from far behind the battle lines, marking a world of discrepancy where wealth and birth always outweighed mere valor. The lesser classes faced relentless exploitation, their courage and sacrifices going unacknowledged. In medieval warfare, a tapestry of ambitions and societal symmetry wove its ironies across the ages. Then, as now, the The struggles of bygone wars form solemn myths, forever set in the deeply scripted theater of class conflict, in the tangled theater of medieval conflict. Capturing a knight was akin to stumbling upon a hidden chest of treasure. These noble prisoners were not merely seen, they were calculated, appraised, and priced like fine goods. Wealthy lords and anxious families ventured into tense diplomatic negotiations to free their captured kin, transforming the grim enterprise of battlefield capture into a vibrant economic opportunity. Not unlike a medieval stock exchange, pieces of land were exchanged, political debts were settled, and rivers of gold coins flowed, all for the sake of securing a loved one's return. The business of ransoming took root as a macabre dance of legal paperwork and heraldic badges, echoing today's elaborate diplomatic dialogues, laden with formalities and power dynamics. Wrapped in a veneer of antiquated language, the price for a nobleman's life could range wildly. Sometimes a mere parish swap sufficed, while at other times entire estates changed hands, weighing human souls on a curious scale of wealth. Once snatched from the battlefield, a captured noble embarked on a predictable yet bizarre journey. He was often met not with chains and dungeons, but with a relative respect, his value far too steep to be squandered through mistreatment. Communicating with his family was permitted, a necessary step to initiate the hushed ransoming ritual. Against the fraught backdrop of heralds delivering messages, honor was as much at play as gold. A neutral party, perhaps a respected peer, would monitor the fairness or their version of attendering. Deals bore the semblance of a just resolution amid the surrounding chaos of combat. For some nobles, surrender was less a shameful act than a calculated maneuver. In a war that often resembled a grand chess match, surrendering could be perceived as the nobleman's ultimate safety net, a way to emerge from the blood-soaked melee physically unscathed. These preemptive concessions whispered of a shared understanding among knights, a mutual recognition of each other's heritage and status. On this shadowed stage, filled with unwritten rules, the players understood the game, acknowledging the meticulous balance between power and survival. History echoes with tales of ransoms that shimmer with intrigue, like the release of the famed King Richard the Lionheart, snared by Duke Leopold V of Austria in 1192. His freedom rested on one of the grandest ransoms ever demanded, a sum that echoed throughout England like a grim bell, ringing coin by coin from every parish and household. Another story speaks of Bertrand du Guesclin, a renowned warrior whose capture demanded a king's ransom, a price that spoke to his martial prowess and the calculated dealings of his captors, reflecting the nuanced medieval perspective on a warrior's worth. The grim reality, though, remained that such luxuries were utterly beyond common soldiers. For these men, lesser born and more readily expendable, capture could mean lifelong servitude or a brutal, unceremonial dismissal from this earthly realm. It was an uncompromising chasm that divided knight from peasant, laying bare the selective empathy woven into the very tapestry of medieval war. The ethical canvas of this time was splattered with shades of gray. Ransoming, while draped in the silk of chivalric traditions, often smeared itself in the mud of pure greed. At times it masqueraded as a noble reprieve, a show of mercy that carved out a semblance of order amid the chaos, while simultaneously propping up the prevailing social order. Yet some families were driven to the brink of ruin by exorbitant demands, forced to rely on hope, fragile promises, and the grudging patience of a captor. The practice perfectly straddled the line between sanctified honor and raw opportunism, a duality that challenges our modern moral compass. From this tumult, however, rose an element of proto-diplomacy amid the ruthless clamor of war. A hint of systematic order emerged from the mire of pillage, binding negotiations that hinted at a shared humanity, even if it was only begrudgingly acknowledged. Although imperfect and deeply self-observing, these customs sowed the primitive seeds of rules that would whisper through the corridors of history. Within the formalized chaos grew ransom agreements, documents as fundamental as deeds to castles or the knots of marital bonds. These carefully penned accords shaped alliances, sowed future enmities, and upheld the social scaffolding of the time. They were threads in the broader weave of chivalric rights, cementing a cycle of conflict and continuity, capturing the curious, enduring balance between ardor and disorder. As these narratives wove through the medieval subconscious, a shared cultural identity materialized, one reflected in tales of courageous escapes and long, bitter imprisonments, legacy deeply etched into the era's rich tapestry. These stories, whether of valor or survival, endured in the oral tradition, a haunting chorus that informed the medieval memory and echoed in the legends passed down through generations. And so, our modern world, while vastly different, is not untouched by these medieval echoes. The ransoming practices that once marched across bloody fields can now be seen as the faint antecedent of our contemporary frameworks for prisoner exchange and complex negotiation. As we peer into the dim looking-glass of history, we may uncover not only relics of antiquity, but profound insights into diplomacy's potential evolution, a timeless reminder of humanity's eternal struggle to balance its inherent brutality with its capacity for empathy in the medieval world, where whispers and word of mouth were the primary messengers. The herald was a figure of imposing significance. Picture a man dressed in eye-catching, brightly colored garments, riding between warring factions with an air of unassailable authority. These heralds were not mere carriers of messages. They were the medium through which the tides of war were both predicted and influenced. Their voices, echoing over pre-battlefields, were like a theater director announcing the next act. Surrounded by the ever-present threat of violence, yet protected by the code of chivalry, the herald wielded immense influence through his words alone. Each proclamation, delivered with practiced, poetic eloquence, could sway the balance toward peace or incite further conflict. His presence was a curious blend of high ceremony and cold strategy. The danger for a herald was very real, yet their immunity was generally respected. For to harm one was to court dishonor and invite chaos. With the arrival of heralds often came the raising of banners, a signal that the theater of war was set to begin. These were no mere identifiers. Each flag, with its vibrant colors and intricate symbols, told tales of family lineage, of sacred allegiances, and ancient feuds, fluttering as ghostly reminders of battles past and promises of combat anew. Warriors looked to their banners for courage. They were a rallying point in the coming chaos, where the visual and the visceral met. The unfurling of these banners was both a declaration and a ritual, a promise that the coming clash was one steeped in honor, even within the inherent brutality of war. It was a spectacle that encapsulated identity and purpose, where the psychology of battle merged with the pageantry of medieval life. Equally theatrical, though far more brutal, were the ritualistic trials by combat. In these sanctioned duels, knights or nobles would resolve disputes through a deadly dance of martial prowess and supposed divine judgment. The clash of armor and the ring of blades were the arguments presented, with God himself cast as the ultimate adjudicator. Tales of honor, property, and reputation teetered on the edge of a sword, the result seen as a decree from on high. This legal theater was as much a spectator sport as it was a system of justice, where onlookers gathered to witness the embodiment of divine will played out by the muscle and might of mortal men. For those who watched, these trials offered stark lessons in law, bravery, and the capricious whims of fate. All of this, the heralds, the banners, and the trials, was underpinned by the code of chivalry, which sought to transform the chaos of war into a structured, if still brutal, performance. Chivalry dictated behavior on the battlefield, urging knights toward acts of valor and gestures of mercy. Though the reality was always complex, some adhered strictly to these ideals, while others contorted them to suit ambition and opportunity. In battle, chivalry was both a moral guide and a practical tool, dictating who lived, who died, and who gained glory in the pursuit of a cause. Knights wore this code like a second skin, desperately crafting a narrative of nobility within the overwhelming clamor of conquest. But trials were not the sole preserve of the battlefield. When disputes amongst nobles threatened the fragile lace of political alliances, formal judicial duels offered a stage to resolve conflicts without spiraling into full-scale war. Here was theater for the elite, a spectacle of precision and procedure where the outcome held sway over land and legacy. Victorious knights walked away with more than a burnished reputation. They secured honor, validated claims, and influenced the shifting order of noble prestige. These duels did not just decide individual fates. They broadcast power and resolve to all who bore witness. It's important to note the role of the audience, for they were not distant onlookers, but active participants. In this martial theater, the crowd's murmur carried weight, their collective verdict shaping the tales that would echo through history long after the immediate results were known. Spectators from all walks of life infused the theater of combat with layers of meaning and interpretation, extending the drama from the duel itself into the realm of collective memory. The tales of these encounters shaped identities, alliances, and the very warp and weft of society's narrative fabric. And what of tournaments and jousting? These grand displays reimagined war's brutality as sport and spectacle. In arenas filled with the clatter of hooves and the splintering crash of lances, knights showcased their skill and valor while publicly reaffirming the ideals of chivalry. These events were a potent blend of entertainment and tradition, reinforcing societal norms while ensuring that even the common folk felt connected to the stories of knighthood. With banners waving, trumpets blaring, and the anticipation of combat simmering among the crowd, such spectacles brought the pageantry of war into a controlled, thrilling theater of its own kind. In the midst of this theater, music provided war's unspoken rhythm. Drums beat a cadence known to rally hearts or signal a retreat. Horns blared commands that guided martial movements across chaotic fields. The oral tapestry of battle was as calculated as it was chaotic, serving both tactical and psychological purposes, ensuring soldiers marched to more than the beat of a drum, but to the pulse of a shared purpose. As the battling ended and the echoes of combat faded, what was left? The stage may have cleared, but the stories remained. From bloodied fields rose tales of triumph and tragedy, recounted by those who survived and memorialized by chroniclers and bards. This aftermath was its own kind of theater, where artifacts like rusted armor and frayed banners prompted quiet contemplation and fervent storytelling. This was the enduring legacy of medieval martial theater, not merely the battles that were fought, but the narratives that were crafted from them, imbued with timeless lessons on power, folly, and the indelible marks left by human ambition and fear. In the desperate theater of medieval siege warfare, the delicate dance of diplomacy took center stage as both sides navigated a precarious game for survival. Imagine the defenders, their backs against the unyielding stone of their city's walls, their food supplies dwindling faster than trust on a battlefield. For them, negotiating a surrender wasn't an admission of cowardice, but a shrewd, calculated choice in the high-stakes chess game of survival. Surrender terms varied wildly, sometimes allowing those trapped inside to leave with their heads high, perhaps even a crumb of dignity intact, or granting temporary reprieves that brought in vital resources. A sense of honor dictated that these negotiations should offer some semblance of dignity for a commander and his troops, allowing them to walk into the future with swords unshattered and pride relatively unscathed for the besieging forces. Securing a peaceful surrender wasn't merely a magnanimous gesture. It was a sound logistical and economic strategy. An intact town was a far greater prize than a smoldering ruin, one that could be quickly integrated into a conqueror's domain, filled with supplies ripe for plundering and offering opportunities for expansion. Yet the promise of safety etched in these agreements was not always worth the ink used to draft them. Treachery often lurked behind closed doors. Peace terms were breached as quickly as they were signed, morphing surrendered safety into tragic betrayal. The annals of history bear witness to cities that opened their gates in hope, only to be met with bloodshed and fire, left to the mercy of victors who found justification in broken promises and a desire for retribution or a brutal exercise of their dominance. Such violations planted seeds of fear and distrust that flourished across the medieval world. A breach of agreed terms dealt a crippling blow to the fragile trust needed for any future negotiations. Defenders soon learned that trusting promises was a gamble with deadly stakes, often prompting them to fight with utter ferocity to the bitter end rather than risk a fatal betrayal. The infamy of such treachery stained a warlord's reputation, teaching nearby towns a grim lesson about the perils of surrendering to a deceitful foe. Enduring a siege was akin to residing in a city teetering on the brink of its final heartbeat. Starvation, unimaginable suffering, and disease unchecked by medical knowledge were the constants of life for those awaiting either salvation or surrender. With each passing day, the specter of despair loomed larger, overshadowing any lingering hope. For families, watching loved ones succumb to hunger was a heart-wrenching inevitability, while the enclosed spaces inside the city walls hastened the spread of disease, making pestilence a more lethal enemy than any besieger's blade. Yet, history gives us accounts of remarkable defiance and resilience. Moments when besieged cities snatched victory from the jaws of certain defeat through clever strategies. From launching daring night raids to deploying disease-infected bodies as crude biological weapons, defenders sometimes managed to out their adversaries. These miraculous turnarounds were often immortalized in tales and songs, celebrated as divine intervention or the fruits of incredible valor. They sparked hope in other besieged communities, inspiring resilience even when all seemed logically lost. Psychological warfare played a binding yet divisive role in sieges. Besiegers wielded fear like a well-honed weapon, using intimidation and dark rumors to coax defenders into surrender. Displays of military might, alongside stories of their previous horrors, were all threads in the tapestry of terror they wove. However, defenders also knew fear could be a unifying force, steering the tide of morale into resolute defiance. Chiefs of the besieged worked to fortify their people's resolve with religious ceremonies, employing misinformation and strategic shows of strength to remind the enemy of their own vulnerabilities. Amid this chaotic dance of deception and fear, betrayal emerged as a potent internal threat. The real danger often lay within the walls, among agitators and opportunists eager to trade loyalty for riches or a better position. An ally, a supposed friend, might open the gates under cover of night, birthing chaos from seeds of pure greed. Those tempted by treachery themselves faced harsh fates once exposed. In this world of paranoia and suspicion, protecting against internal threats proved just as consuming as repelling the massed forces gathered outside. Religious conviction and superstition were woven through the very fabric of siege warfare. Commanders sought blessings for moral fortitude, and relics accompanied soldiers as talismans of divine protection. Besieged defenders leaned heavily on their faith, praying for divine intervention when earthly assistance seemed distant. Eclipses and meteors were not mere cosmic happenstances, but messages from the beyond, whispering of victory or doom. Amulets graced soldiers' necks, and charms tucked into clothing offered intangible armor. Such beliefs shaped decisions in battle, sometimes with more sway than tactical knowledge, keeping morale buoyant or plunging it into despair. In the brutal aftermath of a siege, whether in ruin or relief, a period of rebuilding beckoned. Terror reigned. Where terms had upheld a shred of decency, survivors began anew, reconstructing their lives under new rules. For the victors, integrating these conquered lands was both a challenge and a choice, determining whether resurrection or utter ruin awaited. Conquests that ended in annihilation saw lands left charred and communities fragmented, their agony etched in ash and scar. It was this landscape of ruin or recovery that defined a siege's enduring legacy. It carved lessons into the bones of those who survived, teaching strategies and traits that would echo through generations. These chronicles of resilience and ruin became the stories that framed chivalric ideals and whispered cautionary tales of human ambition's relentless grip. Through them, the past endured its shadows of triumphs and tragedies, stretching out silently but persistently over time. In a land where the clatter and chaos of conflict seemed perpetual. The medieval church sought to impose moments of peace through the truce of God. This ecclesiastical decree attempted to halt warfare on sacred days like Sundays and during important religious seasons such as Lent and Advent. However, amid the clamor of battle, these so-called truces often echoed more of hope than reality. Knights and armies were expected to stow their weapons as a reflection of divine tranquility. Yet, under the surface, ambitious rulers tended to pursue their own interests, risking spiritual reprimand for worldly gain. The church preached peace, but its reach often fell short when faced with the naked ambition of those for whom power and possession spoke louder than any sermon. Despite these holy intentions, adherence to the truths of God remained spotty at best. Ambitious lords would risk whatever spiritual cost was associated with fortifying positions or launching surprise attacks. Wars might occasionally pause for prayer, but they were strategized to resume at the first possible opportunity, and the clang of swords often rang through fields meant to stand still by divine order. Such laws appeased ecclesiastical ideals but did little to constrain earthly desires. Even on days prescribed for peace, the clash of steel might suddenly rupture the air as keen strategists prepared surprise assaults timed flawlessly with the truce's abrupt end, revealing a vast chasm between celestial aspirations and the hardened reality of politics and warfare. The supposed sanctuaries of churches and monasteries, envisioned as inviolate refuges, often found themselves targets in the tide of war. Laden with valuable artifacts like silver chalices and golden-encrusted altarpieces, these holy bastions were handy troves for plundering soldiers. The fabled untouchability of these sites crumbled when met with the pragmatic necessities of survival and conquest, underscoring the tense friction between divine decrees and the pressing demands of war. Feudal lords put spiritual consequences to the side as survival dictated actions, with desecration turning into just another strategic endeavor in these turbulent times. In an era where cunning trumped technology, feast days meant for rest, reflection, and rejoicing found themselves woven immovably into the webs of war. Astute tacticians, with an eye on church calendars, took swift advantage, launching attacks when foes were most vulnerable, caught off guard during celebratory indulgences. The sanctity of these days became pawn to military maneuverings, showcasing both forethought and guile as armies moved unobstructed by immediate threat. Chronicles echo tales of raids sparked amidst acolytes, war blending seamlessly with worship, a stark testimony to how spiritual milestones could occasionally become harrowing opportunities for strategic acumen. Centers of learning and faith played unexpected roles in the field of medieval intelligence. Monks, often unwittingly, participated in these networks. Their knack for record-keeping and their roles as community observers offered vital information to wartime efforts. Yet such involvement carried immense risks. From monasteries, discovered as focal points of espionage, faced dire repercussions, from punitive raids to executions. This plot further entangled the sacred and the secular. Devotion intertwined with deceit, illustrating the dynamic and often contradictory relationship between spiritual and temporal authority. Pilgrimages, usually seen as pathways to spiritual enlightenment, surprisingly intersected with the machinations of war. Pilgrim routes traditionally signified safe passage. The attire was recognized as a symbol of peace and protection. Yet these very symbols often became devices of deception. Armies disguised as pilgrims could slip effortlessly across enemy lands, turning divine assumptions of safe passage into a tangible tactical advantage. Once exposed, such actions compromised the perceived sanctity of pilgrim journeys for everyone, subjecting true pilgrims to new dangers as faith's corridors risked becoming yet another theater of conflict. The ancient custom of sanctuary refuges, where fugitives sought divine protection, showcased another layer of medieval complication, offering a stay from execution within a church's blessed walls. Sanctuary laws presented a deterrent both potent and fraught with peril. Attempting to extract a fugitive from this sanctified asylum courted wrath from both secular authorities and the church itself, plunging those involved into a tempest of political and spiritual discord. These safe havens, quivering lines drawn between human law and divine doctrine, underscored the duality of life, providing temporary reprieve in a tumultuous and violent world. Relics, mighty symbols, touched by sanctity's hand, held a gravitas far beyond their physical presence. Coveted during conflict, these cherished objects offered spiritual prestige and economic prosperity. Their mysterious allure initiated a kind of holy relic hunt, an easy temptation for armies eyeing not just loot, but a form of divine validation. Despite shrewd attempts to safeguard them, many relics vanished amid the confusion of war. Their loss was as much a spiritual blow as it was symbolic of power stripped away, leaving communities bereft of their sacramental heartbeats. The involvement of the Church in warfare emerges as one of the era's starkest ironies. Even as it preached peace, its leaders donned armor alongside the laity. Monasteries fashioned weaponry just as they did rosaries. Bishops led men into battle, while sermons back home extolled the virtues of peace. This jarring juxtaposition unspooled a reality of spiritual commitment, existing alongside a thirst for domination and political strategy. Such contradictions left deep imprints, painting the Church's maneuvers as divinely sanctioned, yet ethically entangled. Safe zones promised solace amidst wars, frenzy urban centers, and holy sites deemed inviolable. Yet these sanctuaries often fell victim to marauding forces indifferent to papal decrees. This construct, while aspirational, succumbed to greed's appetite more often than not. Their intended serenity, overwhelmed by the inexorable demand for resources and strategic advantage. Ultimately, amidst the ever-turning wheel of medieval existence, these sacred enclaves exposed a profound dilemma: the near impossibility of following divine ideals amidst the grasping reality of earthly ambition. This woven legacy of hope and conflict illuminates the intricate and eternal interplay between faith's yearning and the relentless quest for dominion. In the glow of a medieval hearth, the tales of knights and their legendary code of chivalry flicker with allure and profound contradiction. Chivalry dictated bravery, mercy, and fairness, wrapping the brutal chaos of medieval warfare in a cloak of noble ideals. Knights were expected to fight honorably and protect the vulnerable. Yet the harsh realities of war often twisted these ideals into something far less pristine. On the fields where battles unfolded, the line between survival and honor blurred with each swing of the sword, a constant testament to this internal struggle. The bloody stage of medieval warfare often demanded from knights more than just courage. Beneath the armor of these gallant defenders lurked the practical needs of soldiers navigating treachery, ambushes, and outright brutality, burning villages to cripple opponents, launching surprise attacks under the cover of night, and betraying allies were all part of the game. Unsettling as they may seem, these actions were not mere aberrations. They were standard strategies employed by knights who were forced to reconcile their lofty ideals with the grim tactics necessary for survival and victory. The duality of knights respected heroes in one breath, ruthless raiders in another, into the brutal theater of war. Beneath their banners, acts of destruction carried out to weaken enemy morale and supply lines, contrasted sharply with the romanticized heroics woven by troubadours in their ballads. The spoils of warland, wealth, and titles were potent temptations, luring knights into actions far removed from their code's nobleness. Knights employed not only the sword, but also the mind. Deception was an art form, an essential strategy in the medieval toolkit. Feigned retreats, cunning ruses, and surprise attacks allowed for victories, stained less by blood than by cunning. The irony lay in how these acts of trickery, necessary for survival, paradoxically juxtaposed the knightly ideals of open and honorable confrontation. In the heat of battle, the need to win often eclipsed any adherence to the chivalric codes that supposedly governed knightly behavior. Underneath the banners of holy wars and righteous quests, acts we would now call war crimes were committed, towns sacked, prisoners executed. These grotesque spectacles were justified as punitive measures to deter future resistance. They were far from simple acts of anger. They were cold, strategic decisions designed to instill fear and secure swift compliance. The banner of chivalric honor became a guise under which the harsh realities of medieval conflict unfolded, intertwining noble intentions with ruthless necessity. The young eyes of squires, learning from their knightly mentors, witnessed this complex dance between chivalry and brutality firsthand. Theirs was a world colored by the ideals they were taught and the grim realities they observed. These apprentices absorbed lessons that extended far beyond swordplay, seeing honor not as an absolute concept, molded and stretched by the desperate demands of war. While many remember tales of noble damsels, women in medieval warfare sometimes defied those passive roles. During sieges, they defended castles and led with cunning, wielding an influence that often went unrecorded in knightly tomes. Marriages served as political tools, brokering alliances and symbolizing treaties, blurring the lines of chivalric romance with hard-headed strategic reality. Women were both shielded and strategic participants on the chessboard of war, their fates inextricably intertwined with the knights who swore to protect them. Alliances, forged through solemn oaths, could fracture under the immense weight of ambition and opportunity. Knights caught between duty and personal gain sometimes broke vows with alarming frequency. These shifting loyalties and betrayals on the battlefield illuminated the precarious nature of medieval alliances, where strategic pragmatism often dictated actions, casting long shadows on the supposed sanctity of knightly promises. Beyond the physical clash of swords, the theater of war extended into the psychological realm. Chivalric symbols wielded real power, influencing friend and foe long before battle cries rang out. Tales of invincible knights bolstered morale among allies and instilled a palpable dread in opponents, blurring the line between myth and reality. The pageantry wasn't merely for spectacle. It was a psychological tactic, weaving fear and respect into the very core of conflict. As warfare evolved, so too did the knight's role. Shifting strategies and new technologies, like crossbows and cannons, challenged the traditional concepts of individual honor. The growing importance of massed infantry reshaped ideas of chivalry, nudging knights toward coordinated actions that overshadowed individual valor. Modern retellings often romanticize these notions of knightly honor, yet they frequently gloss over the pragmatic ruthlessness lying just beneath the surface. In the end, the concept of honor in medieval warfare leaves us pondering its essence. Were knights truly noble warriors, upholding a timeless ideal? Or were they complex, flawed figures grappling with the harsh, often contradictory demands of survival? The stories of chivalry, with their haunting blend of idealism and reality, continue to resonate, tempting us to peer through the mists of time and wonder if honor was a beautiful myth crafted for inspiration, or a fragile reality constantly tested by the tumult of conflict. In the eerie theater of medieval warfare, the notion of a just war emerged as a grand performance of moral righteousness, dressing up the brutal business of battle in the fine robes of ethical consideration. These were the days when a king or pope could declare a war righteous if it met the somewhat flexible criteria of proper authority, just cause, and right intention. Wars were fought not just on fields, but in the parlors of power, where monarchs and prelates spun tales of divine approval like bards wielding stories of old. Yet beneath this veneer of justice lay a slippery slope where oaths and grievances twisted into convenient pretexts, not unlike the shifting shadows cast by flickering fealty. That binding vow between lord and vassal was paramount in this world. The air was thick with promises and whispered alliances, pledges of loyalty given in return for security and land. But loyalty in the medieval cosmos was as capricious as the wind, blowing favor one moment and sowing discord the next. The record of medieval conflicts is littered with tales of fabricated slights and conveniently broken oaths, exaggerations that provided lords with all the justification they needed to unsheath their swords. It was a game of interpretations, where the lines between loyalty and betrayal blurred like ink on rain-soaked parchment. The Church, omnipresent and omnipotent, played both peacemaker and provocateur. In the grand narrative, the Crusades stood out as a peculiar, potent blend of faith and fervor, transforming soldiers into warriors of God with a promise of absolving sins through sacred violence. The call to retake the Holy Land was not merely about land. It was a celestial mission, a pilgrimage undertaken with steel and blood. The clang of forged armor became music to leaders hungry for power, while the expeditions masked a tapestry of complex motives. Political chessboards extended into lands ripe for conquest, and the sword of salvation cut through both faithless and faithful alike. As fortunes shifted and borders expanded under the guise of divine endorsement, the cry of heresy echoed ominously through the stone corridors of monasteries, serving as yet another powerful justification for conflict. The Church wielded accusations with a deftness that belied its spiritual ambitions, turning theological dissent into a pretext for power grabs. Enemies of the state and rivals in robes were suddenly transformed into heretics, their lands waiting to be seized under the pretense of purging impurities. The most infamous of these, the Albigensian Crusade, revealed how faith could perfectly disguise ambition, with battles fought to the rhythmic chanting of sanctimonious intent, even as bones crunched underfoot and flames licked the sky. Perhaps the Church's most subtle yet coercive tool was excommunication, a sentence that shook the very earth beneath the feet of rulers and rebels alike. To be cast out from the spiritual fold meant to be rendered defenseless, a prime target for ambitious nobles seeking both divine favor and worldly rewards. Darkness descended upon the excommunicated, shadows lengthening over their lands as the license to plunder became sanctioned by heaven's silent nod. In the medieval milieu, excommunication was less a spiritual scarlet letter and more a strategic move on the ever-unraveling game board of medieval Europe. Yet amid the chaos of conflict lay the promise of redemption for knights and kings alike. Pardons, those coveted tokens of forgiveness, dangled as lures for loyalty and submission. The comfort of absolution for past deeds heavy with blood echoed through castle halls, a siren song rendering penance a currency of power. Merciful words masked cold calculation as the line between conqueror and repentant blurred beneath the mantle of divine grace, preserving a hierarchy in which forgiveness was as transactional as any land, title, or treaty. War, at its core, was also about the spoils. The tangible allure of treasure acted as a powerful motivator for soldiers and nobles alike. Looting became a grim but accepted fact of life. The iron clashed not just for honor, but for survival and gain. Swords reduced castles to rubble, and ownership of possessions shifted like the tides, as the Church's cries against avarice mingled with the metallic smell of blood. Wealth changed hands with mercurial agility. There lay a bitter irony that even in holy indignation, ecclesiastical coffers often grew heavy with the wages of war, and all the while, medieval minds looked to the sky for omens, for celestial whispers of destiny amid the chaos. Constellations were twisted into narratives of victory or doom. Each new comet was a harbinger, a cosmic player in a drama where the stars themselves bore witness. Amid this dance of fate and superstition, battles were fought with the heart as much as with the sword, commanders weaving hope and fear into the very air their soldiers breathed. The legal codes of the time, steadfast yet pliable, allowed for episodic abandon, tacit acceptance of chaos in an effort to hold the fragile social tapestry together. As laws bent like willow branches under the weight of wartime necessity, the ambiguous dance of legality spoke volumes about survival, where rules and loopholes coexisted in an uneasy but enduring truce. In this world, steeped in sanctioned chaos and divine sanction, the lines between sin and sanctity blurred like smoke in the medieval night, leaving in their wake tales as haunting and shadowed as the dreamscapes of forgotten realms. In the turbulent times of the Middle Ages, the Church wielded an almost mythical power, straddling the worlds of mortals and the divine with the ease of an institution grounded in both belief and realpolitik. The popes claimed divine right with an almost theatrical gravitas, blessing kings and their wars, transforming earthly conflicts into what could ostensibly be seen as heavenly mandates. This intricate dance of faith and politics made wars into holy crusades, sanctifying the bloodshed that marked the era. For a monarch, a papal blessing was akin to a masterful strategic move on a grand board, necessary to legitimize ambition and aggression. Yet, this endorsement was a double-edged sword, binding the Church to the violence it sanctified and inviting difficult questions about its own moral and spiritual integrity. The Church's endorsement demanded recompense gold, or it a pawn in the games of rulers, manipulated and needed, but often viewed with deep suspicion. Despite this entanglement, Church leaders, like bishops, frequently took up the sword, donning armor and leading men into battle, merging the roles of cleric and warrior. A sight to behold, these bishops in armor wielded both faith and might, much like the famous Odo of Bayeux, who exemplified this strange blend of power. Here was a question of practicality colliding with faith. The martially inclined bishop protected his lands and his flock, but critics raised eyebrows at the glaring inconsistencies with Christian doctrine. How, they wondered, could a man of peace justify the sword? Yet, in the gritty reality of medieval life, this duality provided the Church with a formidable power on earth, a deterrence and a symbol of its far-reaching influence. Meanwhile, nestled in the quiet of monasteries, monks chronicled the period's conflicts. Their quills danced across parchment to capture a world perpetually balancing between valor and destruction. They documented the good, the bad, and the morally perplexing, painting vivid pictures of knights in shining armor and of ruinous sacking. Works like those of Matthew Paris stand as testament to this era, where even divine providence seemed to wrestle with ungodly violence. These accounts provide modern historians a window into the psyche of the time, although it must be said that even the monks were not immune to biases. Their writings often swayed by their own theological leanings and the expectations of their powerful patrons. As battles raged, the Church also played the role of judge, attempting to curb excesses through trials and tribunals. These ecclesiastical courts sat in judgment, addressing war crimes with the intent to uphold the chivalric codes and Christian ethics in a world rampant with brutality. However, the impartiality of such courts was often compromised by the very biases and political pressures that weighed heavily upon them, reflecting the complex power dynamics of medieval society. Nobles might escape with a mere chastisement, whereas common soldiers faced harsh retribution, underscoring the complicated relationship between divine justice and all-too-human error amid the chaos. The Church frequently attempted to play peacemaker, drawing on its considerable spiritual influence to mediate disputes. Its leaders intervened in conflicts, urged at truces, and orchestrated treaties that sometimes succeeded in stitching together the fragile patchwork of medieval politics. These diplomatic missions showcase the Church's potential as a force for peace, although obstacles like deep-seated skepticism, conflicting interests, and entrenched animosities often stood in the way. Yet its successes like the Peace of God and Truce of God movements, testified to its influence and its ability to occasionally direct human affairs toward a higher ideal. The Church's role didn't end when the battle ceased. It took a central place in the rebuilding of war-ravaged lands, guiding survivors through both physical construction and moral recovery. Monasteries offered sanctuary, while churches facilitated acts of penance and reconciliation, a testament to their central place in the social fabric. Yet these efforts, commendable as they were not without their own shadows of ambition. As lands were redistributed and rulers anointed anew, political intrigue, spiced with ecclesiastical ambitions, often flavored the Church's involvement in recovery efforts. The Crusades epitomized the tension between the Church's spiritual mission and its earthly entanglements, preaching fervently about the divine mission to reclaim the Holy Land. They promised absolution and eternal reward, blurring the lines between pilgrimage and warfare. The stark reality of conquest often clashed violently with the idealistic zeal of the Crusaders, leading to atrocities utterly antithetical to Christian values. This paradox saw the Church endorsing the same chaos it sought to cleanse, challenging its moral high ground even as it provided narratives to justify the fissures between doctrine and practice. Through these conflicts, the Church's role as both judge and player was continually tested, its supposed infallibility questioned as it navigated the myriad power struggles of the time. The Great Schism, with rival popes and divergent policies, revealed an institution rife with its own contradictions, even as it sometimes became a tool for secular ambitions. It persisted as a stabilizing force, a constant proclaiming the divine amidst the din of arms and armor. The Church's legacy from these turbulent times remains a complicated tapestry, woven with the threads of spiritual guidance and earthly power, forever entangled in the demanding, relentless dance of history. In the medieval world, war shimmered with the powerful illusion of glory. Noble families, anticipating their progeny's return, adorned with tales of bravery and pockets full of spoils, invested heavily in armory and mighty steeds. Yet beneath this veneer of heroism, the battlefields rippled with hardship and peril, where the gains of war were seldom balanced by its grim realities. The privileged classes indulged in ceremonial departures to battle, their eyes glinting with dreams of wealth and renown. For knights, victory meant a path to heightened stature. A captured enemy knight was often more valuable alive, awaiting a ransom paid in gold or lands. But the truth beneath the sheen of chivalric valor was another matter entirely. For every celebrated knight, many met their end in silence or returned maimed, their dreams dashed by the brutal, indifferent tides of chance. This skewed image of glory motivated the upper echelons to partake in battles, reinforcing their dominion and perpetuating the myth of noble warfare, while offering only a fleeting illusion of honor and prestige. Meanwhile, the peasants, the backbone of the realm, bore the unseen and crushing cost of these martial exploits. Military campaigns were funded not from the luxurious coffers of royalty, but from the calloused, weary hands of the peasantry. Taxes soared during wartime, with every bushel of grain scrutinized by the ever-watchful eyes of tax collectors. As lords enforced their war levies, families teetered on the brink of famine, their meager livelihoods consumed by the demands of distant conquests. The relentless taxation drained villages of their vitality, sinking them into serfdom-like dependency, driving the affluent to ever greater heights, while the common folk sank deeper into poverty. To them, war was but a distant calamity, a far-removed conflict waged on their backs without their voice or agency, a burden that enriched their oppressors and narrowed their already meager existence. Adding to their woes, peasants found themselves swept up into armies through conscription, a method as coercive as it was effective. Unlike knights who sought glory, the commoners dragged to battle did so out of sheer obligation, their lives dismantled by the summoning to arms. Community leaders, often tasked with gathering these reluctant soldiers, watched as neighbors were transformed into combatants overnight, cast from the serenity of farm life into the grinding chaos of warfare. Yet some towns negotiated respite, trading money or grain to spare their young men from the front lines. These bargains, though, offered uneven results, hinging on the fleeting goodwill of local lords or the eerie stability of their region. As they marched into the vortex of war, peasants faced peril not for triumph or territory, but through coercion and the slim, desperate chance of seizing any small spoils amid the disorder. On the front lines, the ordinary warriors met chaos head-on. Where noble knights jousted for glory, the foot soldiers clashed in brutal melee, mired in a cacophony of death cries and the metallic symphony of clashing steel. Chilled by fear and driven by a desperate will to survive, these men found themselves embroiled in battles devoid of the honor or reward promised to their betters. At best, they returned home bearing invisible scars. At worst, they bore the physical reminders of brutality etched permanently into their flesh. As if these hardships were not enough, their homes lay directly in the path of advancing armies, a cruel testament to war's far-reaching impact. Armies needed supplies, and knights took what they desired, leaving behind emptied villages and desolate fields. Such acts were not seen as mere savagery, but as methodical strategies to disenfranchise foes of supporting resources. For peasants, this cycle of destruction left indelible marks. With each passing army, they were reminded of the capriciousness of conflict and the fragility of their existence. Even castles, those imposing fortresses of stone and strength, offered only the illusion of protection for the masses, while within its walls the nobility found refuge. Those on the outside remained exposed to the ravages of war. Very few peasants found solace within these battlements. They were more often reduced to constructing the very fortifications that sheltered only their lords. These walls, bastions of power and grandeur, underscored a glaring reality. Those ringing the town were a cordon maintaining inequality. The mismatched protections revealed the vast gulf between the promise of safety and the reality of vulnerability. Desperation occasionally gave rise to revolt, as peasants pushed to the very edge took up arms in defiance of feudal repression. Though often doomed from the start against organized professional armies, these uprisings represented a courageous break from silent suffering, small flames of resolve, combating the crushing weight of feudalism's iron rule. When crushed, as they usually were, they served as bloody reminders for would-be dissenters, maintaining order through fear and brutal spectacle. Medieval law, too, drafted in inherent favoritism through unjust dispositions. The scales of justice weighed heavily upon the plebeians, while knights and lords found shelter in trials of honor and privilege. The system itself was a theater, masking predetermined outcomes. This facade of fairness embedded disenfranchisement deep into the culture. The law afforded privilege, while the ordinary suffered under arbitrary decrees. Chroniclers, tasked with immortalizing the deeds of the age, penned stories shaped by patronage and prejudice. Their narratives reverberated with noble exploits, often omitting the common man's plight entirely. History, as it was recorded, raised knights upon plinths, while the tales of those who bled to secure their laurels dissolved into mere whispers, lost to time. And yet even these grand tapestries of power unraveled eventually. Pressure from within and outside wrought change upon the rigid feudal orders. The very constructs designed to buttress empires fell prey to the relentless march of progress, where traditions eroded by time's tide gave way to new ideals and alliances. So concludes our tale, a saga of power and plight eternally intertwined, overshadowed by an empire's downfall and hints of future upheaval. A reminder that while the mighty seem protected, the ground beneath them ever shifts.